When we think about medieval life, our minds often jump to knights, kings, queens, and maybe a few peasants working the fields. But the Middle Ages were incredibly complex, and behind the famous faces was a hidden workforce keeping society alive. These were the jobs nobody talks about, roles that were often smelly, dangerous, or just plain bizarre, yet utterly essential. Today, we're going to explore the unsung laborers of medieval Europe, revealing a world you won't find in history textbooks. Take the gong farmers, for example. Their job, cleaning out privies and cesspits, basically medieval toilets at night. They dealt with waste that would make modern sanitation workers gag. And yet, their labor was essential for urban life. Without them, towns would have been engulfed by disease and stench. Gong farmers were paid, yes, but their social status, pretty much the lowest of the low. Still, in their own grim way, they were city saviors. Then there were knocker-uppers, a role that might sound modern, but existed in proto-forms even in medieval towns. Before alarm clocks or the concept of waking up on your own, someone had to ensure that workers, merchants, and laborers woke up in time. Often, it was a neighbor or a low-status servant who banged on doors or windows. Missing a day could mean lost wages or spoiled produce. Imagine relying on a person to rap on your bedroom window every morning. Medieval life was intimate in ways we rarely consider. Another unsung role was that of the sin eater. In rural communities, death was a constant companion. When someone passed away, the sin eater would symbolically consume bread or rail over the corpse, taking on the deceased's sins to help their soul rest peacefully. This job was deeply spiritual, but also socially isolating. The sin eater was often viewed with suspicion or fear. Yet, this role highlights the medieval belief system and community structure, where labor could be both essential and spiritually significant. We also find professions like witch-finders, tax collectors, and plague inspectors. Each role carried danger, stigma, or sheer unpleasantness. Tax collectors were despised, plague inspectors faced contagion daily, and witch-finders walked the razor-thin line between law, superstition, and mob fury. Life for these individuals was anything but glamorous, yet the medieval economy, social order, and survival depended on them. And of course, there were the animal workers. Every horse, pig, cow, and chicken required caretakers, people who cleaned stables, collected dung, and ensured livestock thrived. While we might think of medieval farming as heroic or pastoral, it involved hours of tedious, dirty labor that rarely made it into legends or stories. Without these animal workers, towns would starve, armies would lack horses, and trade would stall. What's fascinating is that many of these roles combined practicality, superstition, and societal necessity. A person could be feared, laughed at, or shunned, yet their labor was fundamental to medieval survival. The unsung workforce maintained cities, supported agriculture, enforced laws, and even safeguarded spiritual well-being. In this series, we're going to dive deep into these forgotten professions, from the disgusting to the dangerous, from the bizarre to the brilliant. Each chapter will reveal how medieval society functioned through the labor that history almost forgot. Next, we'll explore the night soil collectors, gong farmers, and sewer workers, delving into their smelly yet vital contributions to medieval urban life. When we imagine medieval cities, we often picture bustling markets, towering cathedrals, and cobblestone streets. What we rarely think about is a mountain of waste accumulating behind the scenes. Human excrement, animal dung, and household garbage piled up daily, and someone had to deal with it. Enter the night soil collectors and gong farmers. The medieval city's dirty heroes, who ensured people could walk through streets without drowning in their neighbors' waste. Night soil collectors were the unsung warriors of urban hygiene. Their job was simple to describe, but terrifying to execute, emptying cesspits, chamber pots, and latrines, often under the cover of darkness. They carried buckets, wheelbarrows, and sometimes specialized tools to remove waste from homes and public latrines. In crowded cities like London or Paris, this was no small task. Streets were narrow, often lined with open drains, and humans lived cheek to cheek with animals. The smell alone was enough to make modern noses revolt. But medieval citizens depended on these workers to survive. Gong farmers, a term that might make you chuckle today, were essentially specialists in handling human waste from cesspits. They worked primarily at night, hence gong, which referred to the bells warning others of their nocturnal presence. Their labor was physically demanding, dangerous, and profoundly unpopular socially. Yet these workers were crucial in preventing disease outbreaks, controlling odors, and maintaining a semblance of cleanliness in urban centers. Without them, medieval cities would have quickly become uninhabitable. Safety was a real concern. Cesspits were often deep, dark, and filled with noxious gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. Accidents were common. Falls, gas poisoning, and even drowning occurred. Protective gear, minimal. Knowledge of bacteria, non-existent. Night soil collectors and gong farmers relied on intuition, experience, and sheer toughness to navigate these hazards. Their courage, often overlooked in history books, kept cities functional. Social status for these workers was abysmally low. Despite performing essential labor, they were considered dirty and undesirable, living on the fringes of society. Many communities feared them, avoided them, or ridiculed them. Yet, in a practical sense, they were indispensable. Some collectors even formed informal guilds, sharing knowledge, tools, and safety tips, creating a secret society of urban survival experts. Interestingly, the work of night soil collectors wasn't purely waste removal. They played a vital role in fertilizer production. Collected human excrement, known as night soil, was transported to nearby farms where it enriched fields. This practice demonstrates the medieval approach to recycling and resource management. Waste was not merely disposed of, it was transformed into something useful, feeding the next generation of crops. In a way, night soil collectors were early environmental engineers, turning filth into fertility. There were also unique social dynamics associated with this work. Some collectors used humor to cope with the stench and danger, telling stories of near misses, monstrous smells, and unexpected encounters. Urban legends often featured night soil collectors, sometimes as terrifying figures who could sniff out secrets or haunt streets at night. These tales reflect both society's fear of the dirty job and the acknowledgement of its necessity. The interplay of labor, danger, and social perception in this job highlights a broader truth. Medieval cities relied on hidden networks of essential workers to function. While knights defended territories and merchants traded goods, it was the night soil collectors and gong farmers who literally cleared the path for civilization to thrive. Their contribution was invisible to most, smelly and unpleasant, yet profoundly important. In conclusion, night soil collectors and gong farmers were far more than dirty laborers. They were urban survival specialists, resource managers, and unseen heroes. They remind us that medieval life was complex, interdependent, and often dependent on the labor that nobody wanted to talk about, but everyone relied on. In the next chapter, we'll explore another set of overlooked roles, from sin-eaters and plague inspectors to body bearers and animal caretakers, revealing the bizarre dangerous, and fascinating jobs that kept medieval society running. While night soil collectors and gong farmers dealt with filth and waste, another category of medieval jobs involved fear, superstition, and the management of death itself. These were roles that society both needed and feared, occupations that put people face to face with mortality, disease, and social stigma. Welcome to the world of sin eaters, plague inspectors, and other jobs nobody talks about, where danger, ritual, and human ingenuity intertwined. Let's begin with the sin eaters. These individuals performed a chilling yet spiritually significant task, consuming food or drink over the body of the deceased, symbolically absorbing the sins of the dead. Sin eaters existed primarily in rural communities in Europe, particularly in regions like Wales and parts of England. Their work was deeply ritualistic and linked to the prevailing belief that a soul could not rest unless sins were absolved. The job required neither skill with tools nor physical strength, but it demanded psychological resilience and a willingness to be socially isolated. Sin eaters were often shunned or treated with suspicion, as absorbing sins was both feared and seen as spiritually unclean. Yet their contribution was vital, providing a ritual service that communities deeply valued. Then there were the plague inspectors, who emerged during epidemics like the Black Death. These brave or perhaps desperate individuals were tasked with identifying infected households, managing quarantine zones, and sometimes even marking doors with lime or symbols to warn others. Their job was extremely dangerous, with high mortality rates, but it was a crucial line of defense against the spread of deadly diseases. Plague inspectors had to balance public health and social panic, often facing angry townsfolk or terrified neighbors who resented interference with their homes or daily routines. A related role was that of the body bearers or mortuary attendants. Medieval cities and villages produced a constant flow of the dead from disease, famine, or accidents. Someone had to collect corpses from streets, homes, and battlefields, transport them to burial grounds, and prepare them for interment. This job was physically demanding, emotionally taxing, and socially stigmatized. Workers faced the dual threats of disease and fear, as the living often associated death with contamination and bad luck. Yet without these attendants, communities would have been overwhelmed, and the spread of disease would have been far worse. Somewhat less grim, but equally overlooked, were the animal caretakers and knackers yard workers. Medieval towns relied on horses, oxen, and livestock for transportation, agriculture, and trade. Animal caretakers cleaned stables, transported manure, and cared for sick or injured animals. Meanwhile, knackers processed dead animals, turning hides, bones, and meat scraps into usable products. Both roles were essential for survival and commerce, yet socially, they were considered low status and often repulsive because of constant contact with waste, blood, and decay. Other bizarre or dangerous jobs included witch-finders, rat-catchers, and leech collectors. Witch-finders enforced laws and superstition, often putting themselves in conflict with fearful communities. Rat-catchers managed the vermin that spread plague, sometimes employing terriers or ferrets to hunt in sewers and buildings, a smelly and hazardous task. Leech collectors, who gathered blood-sucking leeches for medical use, spent hours in wetlands, mud, and stagnant water, dealing with bites, disease, and the elements. What all these roles have in common is that they were essential yet stigmatized, dangerous yet indispensable. Society relied on people willing to confront death, disease, and filth, often for minimal reward and little social respect. These hidden professions reveal the complexity of medieval life, where survival depended on labor that balanced practical necessity with cultural, spiritual, and social dimensions. In conclusion, sin eaters, plague inspectors, body bearers, animal caretakers, under the shadowed roles show that medieval society had a hidden labor network, sustaining communities in ways that history often overlooks. They remind us that the Middle Ages were not only about kings and knights, they were also about the unsung individuals who dealt with the uncomfortable, the dangerous, and the bizarre to keep society functioning. Next, we'll explore the dirty, risky, and sometimes hilarious world of medieval waste-related and city maintenance jobs, diving deeper into how towns stayed clean, productive, and alive through work nobody wants to talk about. When you think about medieval cities, you probably imagine bustling markets, grand cathedrals, and lively streets. But behind that picturesque image was a world of grime, risk, and labor nobody talks about. Medieval towns and cities depended on a network of workers performing jobs that were disgusting, hazardous, or socially stigmatized, yet absolutely essential for survival. In this chapter, we dive into these roles, the people who kept cities alive, functioning, and, surprisingly, sometimes even sanitary. Let's start with the street cleaners and scavengers. Streets were not only crowded with people and animals, but they were also literal rivers of waste, garbage, animal droppings, and human excrement often flowed freely, especially after rain. Street cleaners and scavengers were tasked with collecting refuse, sweeping streets, and sometimes transporting waste to designated dumping areas. Their work was grueling, physically demanding, and perpetually unpleasant. Yet without them, towns would have been uninhabitable, filled with filth, vermin, and disease. Connected to this were the rat catchers and pest controllers. Rodents were everywhere, feeding on leftover food, spreading disease, and sometimes attacking livestock or pets. Rat catchers used a combination of ferrets, dogs, traps, and sheer cunning to control infestations. They often worked in sewers, attics, and warehouses, places reeking of filth and decay. These jobs were risky not only from bites and scratches, but also from exposure to disease. A rat catcher's value to the city was immense, though their social standing remained frustratingly low. Night watchmen and town guards also played a hidden role in maintaining order. While their job might sound honorable, it was dangerous and grueling. Patrolling the streets at night meant confronting thieves, rioters, or drunken revelers, and all this while navigating dark alleys, muddy streets, and hazardous conditions. They also had to deal with the smells and messes of a city that never slept. Night watchmen were the invisible eyes, keeping urban life functioning, balancing vigilance with survival. Then there were the plumbers, water carriers, and well diggers. Sanitation in medieval cities was primitive. Plumbing systems were limited. Wells could become contaminated, and water often needed to be hauled manually from distant sources. Plumbers repaired rudimentary pipes, cleared clogs, and ensured that water flowed where it was needed. Water carriers transported this essential liquid, sometimes walking miles daily, balancing heavy containers and dealing with mud, waste, and unpredictable weather. Their labor kept the city hydrated, washed, and alive. Another overlooked role was the street announcer or town crier. While this might sound quaint today, medieval news dissemination was essential. Town criers shouted important notices, market news, or royal decrees through crowded, noisy, and smelly streets. They risked exposure to disease, insults, and sometimes physical harm from disgruntled citizens. In a pre-printing press era, their voice was a lifeline, yet the role carried no glamour and constant risk. And let's not forget the latrine emptiers and cesspit cleaners, a continuation of the night soil collectors we discussed earlier. Urban populations produced vast quantities of waste daily, and the logistics of removing it safely required organized labor. These workers were exposed to stench, disease, and occasional accidents. Despite the danger and social stigma, they kept cities from becoming breeding grounds for illness and epidemic. Their work literally kept civilization functioning. Interestingly, many of these jobs intersected. A rat catcher might collaborate with a scavenger to clear refuse a water carrier, might alert a night watchman to a flooded street, or block drain cesspit cleaners and gong farmers ensured that street cleaning and pest control efforts were effective. This interconnected labor network shows that medieval cities were far from chaotic. They were complex systems, relying on people willing to do the unglamorous, the dirty, and the dangerous. In conclusion, the hidden workforce of medieval cities was diverse, essential, and remarkably resilient. Street cleaners, rat catchers, night watchmen, plumbers, water carriers, and cesspit emptiers ensured that urban life could continue despite filth, disease, and social challenges. These jobs may have been unpleasant, undervalued, or ignored by history, but they reveal a society that survived through ingenuity, courage, and relentless labor. Next, we'll explore the bizarre, bizarrely specific, and sometimes shocking jobs in rural and domestic life, highlighting the strange tasks and occupations that medieval communities relied on, often with humor, danger, or both. When we picture medieval villages, we often imagine farmers tending fields, blacksmiths hammering iron, and maybe a baker kneading dough. But the reality was far stranger and far more fascinating. Behind the idyllic images of peasant life lay a host of bizarre, essential, and sometimes grotesque jobs that history rarely mentions. These were the occupations that kept rural life functioning, maintained households, and sometimes even bridged the line between the practical and the mystical. Let's start with gong farmers in rural areas. Similar to their urban counterparts, while towns had night soil collectors for city streets, villages often relied on locals to empty privies, cesspits, and chamber pots, sometimes carrying waste to nearby fields for fertilizer. This work was smelly, labor-intensive, and socially stigmatized, but it was also a vital part of agricultural life, turning human waste into nourishment for crops and supporting the food chain that fed entire communities. Another strange but crucial role was the sheep shearer, who did more than just cut wool. Shearing involved skill, speed, and stamina. Sheep were prone to kicking, biting, or trampling inexperienced handlers. A poor shearer could injure animals or themselves. Beyond the physical demands, shearers often worked seasonally and traveled from village to village, creating a network of itinerant labor. Wool was a primary medieval export, so these workers were literally producing wealth with scissors and skill. Then there were beekeepers, a job that might seem quaint today, but was essential in medieval life. Honey was one of the few sweeteners available, and beeswax was crucial for candles, sealing documents, and religious rituals. Beekeepers faced the hazards of stings, unpredictable hives, and the challenge of transporting bees safely. Their labor was delicate, demanding, and critical for both culinary and spiritual life. Moving to the domestic sphere, consider the lavender women or household scent makers. In a time when bathing was infrequent, keeping homes smelling decent required herbs, flowers, and perfumed oils. These women collected, dried, and distributed aromatic plants, working with techniques passed down through generations. Their work was both practical, masking odors, and socially significant, enhancing comfort, health, and prestige. A particularly bizarre job was that of the chamber servant, responsible for cleaning, carrying, and sometimes even managing the bodily functions of the household. They emptied chamber pots, cleaned garderobes, and sometimes even assisted in private rituals of hygiene. While physically demanding and odorous, this role was often one of the most trusted positions in a noble household, reflecting the intimate and delicate nature of domestic life. Some rural jobs were even tied to superstition. Fortune tellers, charm makers, and local healers worked alongside practical laborers. They might create protective amulets, advise on crop planting, or perform rituals to ward off disease. While some historians dismiss these roles as quaint or irrational, in practice they were deeply integrated into the social and agricultural fabric, blending folk wisdom, religion, and practical problem solving. Animal care in villages also produced unexpected roles. Pig herd attendants, goose keepers, and mule drivers ensured livestock survived, reproduced, and served their communities. Some of these jobs were highly seasonal, demanding long hours in mud, rain, and heat. Others required significant skill, particularly when transporting animals to markets or handling unpredictable behavior. The success of the local economy often depended on these invisible hands working tirelessly behind the scenes. Even the mundane could be bizarre. Scavengers of leftovers, compost workers, and night watch helpers performed labor that might seem trivial or disgusting to us. Yet these roles were integral to village hygiene, crop production, and food security. Villagers understood that survival depended not just on what was visible plowed fields, bakeries, or smithies, but on the hidden labor, keeping everything running. In conclusion, rural and domestic jobs in the Middle Ages were diverse, essential, and often strange or challenging. From gong farmers and shearers to beekeepers, chamber servants, and herbalists, these roles reveal the complex interplay of survival, skill, superstition, and social hierarchy. Without these workers, villages would have faltered, households would have been unmanageable, and society as a whole would have struggled to thrive. Next, we'll explore the dangerous and deadly roles in warfare, construction, and the medieval economy, highlighting the hidden labor that fueled both survival and expansion in the Middle Ages. When we think of medieval labor, images of peaceful farming or occasional swordplay come to mind. But beneath that idyllic vision were professions defined by risk, physical strain, and sheer endurance. These were the jobs that kept towns alive, armies supplied, and societies functioning, often at the cost of the workers' health, comfort, or even life. In this chapter, we explore the dangerous, grueling, and underappreciated roles that formed the backbone of medieval survival. Let's start with miners and quarry workers. Extracting coal, iron, salt, or stone was brutally difficult. Mines were cramped, poorly ventilated, and prone to collapse. Workers often endured toxic fumes, flooding, and cave-ins, with little protective gear beyond rough clothing and primitive tools. Salt miners, in particular, faced chronic exposure to dust and salt, which could damage lungs and skin. Despite the risks, their labor was essential. Salt preserved food, iron built weapons, and stone built the infrastructure of cities and castles. Without these workers, entire economies would have stagnated. Next, consider construction laborers and roofers. Building castles, churches, and fortifications required men who could climb, lift, and balance on scaffolding with no safety nets. Falls were frequent and often fatal. Tasks that today seem routine, moving stones, hoisting timber, or carving intricate details, required enormous strength, skill, and coordination. Laborers were often paid little and exposed to extreme weather. Yet medieval architecture relied entirely on their courage and endurance. Then there were soldiers, mercenaries, and siege engineers, roles that combined danger, skill, and strategic importance. Soldiers faced death on the battlefield, but siege engineers endured long hours constructing towers, battering rams and trenches, often under enemy fire. Accidents were frequent, from collapsing siege machines to misfired projectiles. Despite the heroism we romanticize, the vast majority of these workers were ordinary men risking life and limb for survival, wages, or duty. Danger extended to urban labor as well. Blacksmiths, tanners, and leather workers handled fire, sharp tools, and toxic chemicals daily. Blacksmiths worked with molten metal, often suffering burns or eye injuries. Tanners immersed themselves in vats of animal hides, lime, and urine, a process that produced fumes, skin irritation, and long-term health issues. Their product stalls, shoes, armor were indispensable, yet the labor came at a heavy personal cost. Water transport and fishing were equally hazardous. River and canal workers, boatmen, and fishermen risked drowning, hypothermia, and unpredictable weather. Moving goods by boat was essential for trade and supply. Yet medieval water transport lacked modern safety measures. Many small rivers, canals, or flooded streets could become death traps for inexperienced or unlucky workers. Even farming, often romanticized, could be dangerous. Plowing with heavy oxen, harvesting on steep hillsides, or handling wild animals sometimes resulted in broken bones, injuries, or worse. Seasonal laborers often worked from dawn to dusk with minimal rest, exposed to storms, heat, or frost. Their toil sustained cities, armies, and markets, yet their social status remained low. Medical labor, too, carried risk. Apothecaries, barber surgeons, and plague responders faced contagious diseases and crude medical tools. Treating wounds without antiseptics or protective measures exposed workers to infection, bloodborne illness, and the constant threat of epidemic. Yet without them, injuries and disease would have devastated populations. What ties all these roles together is a combination of necessity, danger, and invisibility. Medieval society depended on people willing to endure risk, pain, and social stigma to keep systems running, from infrastructure and defense to food production and medicine. These workers rarely appear in chronicles, yet their labor was fundamental to survival and growth. In conclusion, dangerous and grueling work was the hidden foundation of medieval life. Miners, construction laborers, soldiers, blacksmiths, tanners, water workers, and medical responders all contributed to society under extreme conditions. Their courage, endurance, and skill remind us that medieval history is not just about kings and nobles, it's about the ordinary people who made survival possible, often at great personal cost. Next, we'll explore the bizarre, absurd, and often humorous medieval jobs roles that were strange, socially awkward, or downright hilarious, but still vital to the economy and daily life. While dangerous and grueling work formed the backbone of medieval survival, the Middle Ages also featured jobs that were bizarre, amusing, or downright absurd, yet still crucial for society. From animal whisperers to human scarecrows, these roles reveal a world where practicality, superstition, and humor intersected in fascinating ways. One of the strangest roles was that of the gong farmer, which we've mentioned before, but in some regions, their work included innovative odor management techniques. Some night soil collectors added straw, lime, or herbs to cesspits, experimenting with primitive deodorizing methods. Essentially, they were medieval chemical engineers, solving urban sanitation problems with creativity and a lot of courage. Then there were town jesters with official duties. Beyond entertainment, jesters sometimes acted as social mediators, delivering criticism of nobles or officials in a humorous guise. Their jokes were more than comedy, they were tools for communication, influencing decisions, while avoiding political danger. Imagine walking a tightrope between laughter and insult. Everyday medieval humor was serious business. Another absurd but important job was the dog whipper. In crowded towns, stray dogs caused chaos, scared livestock, and spread disease. The dog whipper's role was to chase, control, and sometimes punish dogs, keeping public spaces manageable. Armed with sticks or whips, they patrolled streets and markets. To outsiders, this may seem ridiculous, but their labor reduced bites, prevented food spoilage, and protected citizens. Bell ringers and crier assistants also had surprisingly nuanced jobs. Beyond calling townsfolk to church or announcing news, they sometimes acted as emergency communicators, signaling fires, floods, or approaching armies. Their seemingly ceremonial task had life or death implications, demanding attention, endurance, and vocal strength. Missing a bell toll or a town crier's shout could literally mean disaster. Medieval households featured unique domestic jobs as well. Chamber pot washers, floor scrubbers, and candle trimmers performed repetitive, dirty, yet essential tasks. In large noble houses or monasteries, maintaining hygiene, light, and comfort required armies of invisible laborers. The work was low status, repetitive, and often exhausting, but without them, daily life would have been impossible. Animal-related roles produced even stranger occupations. Swineherds who managed pigs in forested commons sometimes had to corral animals away from crops, chase wild boars, or protect them from predators. In certain regions, people were employed as falcon feeders, dog trainers, or goose masters, ensuring these animals fulfilled hunting, guarding, or ceremonial functions. Though unusual, these positions were integral to food supply, security, and leisure in elite circles. Some of the funniest jobs were ceremonial. In English and French courts, official foals or human scarecrows sometimes accompanied nobles, performing symbolic roles during parades or festivals. They might wave flags, throw confetti, or mimic enemies. While these roles appear absurd to modernize, they reinforced social hierarchy, tradition, and morale, making the ridiculous both entertaining and socially significant. Finally, superstition created specialized professions. Charm sellers, plague scapegoat coordinators, and ritual assistants worked alongside practical laborers. They produced talismans, advised on crop planting, or performed purification rituals. While their work might seem irrational, it was deeply embedded in medieval culture, blending spiritual beliefs with daily survival. In conclusion, strange and absurd jobs reveal the creativity, adaptability, and humor of medieval societies. Gong farmers, dog whippers, jesters, ceremonial fools, and ritual assistants were all part of a network that kept society functioning, entertained, and spiritually reassured. Their stories remind us that medieval life was complex, multidimensional, and often stranger than fiction. Next, we'll explore medieval professions tied to commerce, trade, and travel roles that connected villages, towns, and cities, and enabled the growth of a wider economy. These jobs were essential for medieval commerce, yet often overlooked in history books. By history, today, we shine a light on the unsung middlemen of medieval economy, whose labor shaped markets, towns, and the flow of goods. Let's begin with the messengers and couriers. Long before modern postal systems, information and goods traveled on foot, horseback, or river. Couriers were responsible for delivering letters, contracts, and small parcels across sometimes perilous terrain. Bandits, rough weather, and political unrest made every journey risky. Missing a delivery could jeopardize trade deals or diplomatic missions, while successful couriers enabled communication across kingdoms. Their work required endurance, trustworthiness, and a keen sense of navigation. Without them, commerce would grind to a halt. Closely linked were the market inspectors and weighers. In medieval marketplaces, goods had to be measured, weighed, and sometimes inspected for quality or contamination. Market inspectors ensured that merchants did not cheat customers, measured goods fairly, and sometimes collected taxes or tolls. These roles were critical for economic stability. Imagine buying flour, wine, or wool without someone guaranteeing that your measure was accurate. Cheating would be rampant, and trust in markets would collapse. Inspectors performed a mundane but vital service, often facing angry merchants or skeptical townsfolk. Next, consider innkeepers and tavern staff. Beyond providing food, drink, and lodging, inns served as communication hubs, informal banks, and trading posts. Merchants, travelers, and messengers relied on inns for safe rest, storage of goods, and sharing of market intelligence. The staff had to manage logistics, security, and hospitality, all while maintaining order among sometimes unruly patrons. The efficiency and reputation of an inn could influence regional trade patterns. In other words, the medieval economy ran on hospitality as much as on production. Another overlooked group were the transport workers and porters. Moving goods from village to village or to larger urban centers was physically exhausting. Heavy barrels of grain, sacks of wool, and crates of goods had to be carried, loaded onto carts, and sometimes ferried across rivers. These laborers worked long hours in sun, rain, and mud, ensuring that products reached markets and trade networks remained functional. Without their endurance, towns would face shortages, trade would stagnate, and economies would falter. Dock workers and shiploaders were equally essential. Ports were the gateways to international trade, linking Europe to the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and beyond. Loading ships required precision and strength. Errors could sink cargo or ruin deals. Dock workers also managed customs, tariffs, and sometimes security, ensuring that both goods and coins flowed safely. These jobs were perilous, demanding, and rarely celebrated, but their impact on commerce was monumental. Even scribe assistants and clerks played a vital role. Trade required contracts, ledgers, and correspondence. Scribes meticulously recorded transactions, kept track of inventories, and drafted legal documents. Mistakes could result in financial loss, legal disputes, or ruined reputations. Though they worked in dusty offices or candle-lit rooms, rather than fields or streets, their labor underpinned the very trust and legality necessary for trade. Interestingly, many of these commercial jobs intersected with risk, hygiene, and superstition. Couriers might traverse plague-affected towns, porters handled rotting or pest-infested goods, and market inspectors sometimes dealt with accusations of witchcraft or fraud. Labor in commerce was not only physically and mentally demanding, but socially and politically sensitive, requiring resilience, skill, and diplomacy. In conclusion, commerce and trade in the Middle Ages were powered by a vast network of often invisible, physically demanding, and socially overlooked roles. Messengers, market inspectors, innkeepers, porters, dock workers, and scribes ensured that goods, information, and trust flowed across kingdoms. Their labor allowed medieval society to function economically, supported armies, towns, and agriculture, and laid the foundations for modern markets. Next, we'll explore travel, transport, and the risky journeys that kept medieval Europe connected, highlighting the workers who bridged geography, weather, and danger to maintain society's lifelines. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of villages, towns, and cities, often separated by forests, rivers, and rugged terrain. While nobles could ride in relative comfort, the laborers and workers who ensured that goods, messages, and services moved across the land faced constant danger, exhaustion, and unpredictability. In this chapter, we explore the hidden heroes of medieval travel and transport, the people who kept society connected, despite perilous conditions. Let's begin with the carters and wagon drivers. Moving grain, livestock, timber, or trade goods required enormous physical effort. Roads were often muddy, uneven, and poorly maintained. Horses and oxen were prone to stumbling or bolting, and carts could easily tip, crushing goods or worse, the driver. Carters often traveled alone or in small groups, vulnerable to robbery or attacks by wild animals. A single accident could destroy a family's livelihood or delay critical supplies. Despite these risks, these workers were essential for connecting farms to markets, towns to ports, and villages to castles. Then there were boatmen and ferrymen. Rivers were vital highways, but navigating them was no simple task. Floods, strong currents, and hidden rocks made travel hazardous, especially for heavily loaded barges or rafts. Ferrymen transported people, animals, and cargo across rivers, sometimes charging tolls or providing safe passage during emergencies. In winter, ice or storms could trap them, making survival a matter of skill, experience, and luck. Their labor was critical for commerce and communication, yet their lives were perpetually on the edge of disaster. Pilgrimage guides and messengers were another group of unsung laborers. Pilgrimages to sacred sites like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome were not only spiritual journeys, but also opportunities for trade and networking. Guides led travelers through forests, across mountains, and past dangerous territories. Messengers carried urgent letters or contracts over long distances, often exposed to bandits, hostile weather, and illness. Success required endurance, courage, and navigational skills that modern travelers rarely consider. High-risk travel also existed in urban settings. Town porters and delivery workers were tasked with moving goods through crowded streets, often balancing heavy loads while dodging pedestrians, carts, and animals. In cities with medieval festivals, market days, or royal visits, the chaos could be extreme. These workers were the lifeblood of urban supply chains, yet their labor was largely invisible to the townspeople they served. Some roles combined physical danger with social complexity. Envoys and diplomatic couriers, for example, transported sensitive messages between courts, monasteries, or city councils. Failure could mean political consequences, loss of prestige, or imprisonment. These workers were required to navigate both geography and the delicate web of medieval politics, walking a tightrope between safety, accuracy, and discretion. Even leisure and entertainment relied on dangerous labor. Tournament marshals, animal wranglers for fairs, and traveling performers often moved across difficult terrain, sometimes under attack from highwaymen or angry townsfolk. They had to ensure equipment, animals, and performers arrived intact, and that audiences were entertained safely, no small feat in a world without modern infrastructure. What stands out about these jobs is their interconnectedness with survival, economy, and society. Without carters, ferrymen, messengers, and urban porters, markets would falter, villages would face shortages, and communication would grind to a halt. Workers took risks daily, facing physical, social, and environmental hazards, yet history rarely remembers them. Their labor was the invisible thread holding the medieval world together. In conclusion, medieval travel and transport were perilous enterprises requiring courage, stamina, and skill. Carters, boatmen, ferrymen, pilgrimage guides, messengers, porters, and performers all ensured that Europe's communities remained connected, informed, and supplied. These workers reveal the hidden human effort behind the apparent simplicity of medieval life, showing that survival and prosperity depended on risk, endurance, and dedication. Next, we'll conclude our journey by exploring the rarest, most bizarre, and most overlooked medieval jobs, tying together themes of danger, absurdity, and indispensability that have threaded through every chapter. After exploring filth, danger, absurdity, commerce, and transport, we arrive at the culmination of medieval labor obscurity, the rarest, strangest, and most overlooked jobs. These roles were often limited to specific regions, social contexts, or events, yet they reveal the sheer creativity and adaptability of medieval society. From ceremonial oddities to specialized artisans, these workers played critical roles in keeping communities alive, entertained, and organized. One fascinating example is the whipping boy's assistant in certain noble households. While the role of the whipping boy is better known, a companion punished in place of a young prince. The assistant ensured the process ran smoothly, managed logistics, and sometimes dealt with the prince's tantrums or complaints. It sounds absurd, even cruel, but in a society where royal children were insulated from consequences, this job was oddly necessary to maintain discipline. Another rare position was the castle dovecote keeper. Dovecotes, structures housing pigeons, were essential for food, fertilizer, and sometimes communication. The keeper managed feeding, nesting, and protection of birds, ensuring sufficient eggs, meat, and droppings for the household or estate. While it seems eccentric today, the role was indispensable for nutrition and agriculture. Then there were plague burial diggers or grave diggers of necessity. Unlike regular cemetery attendants, these workers operated during epidemics, sometimes digging mass graves under horrific conditions, often with minimal protective measures. Mortality was high, and the work was physically and emotionally taxing. Despite being feared and shunned, they were essential in preventing disease spread and maintaining public health infrastructure during crisis. Some professions were ceremonial yet highly specialized. Court minstrels, falconry attendants, and festival choreographers maintained social order, culture, and entertainment. A minstrel might simultaneously serve as messenger, gossip distributor, or political commentator. Falconry attendants trained birds for hunting, monitored their health, and ensured that nobles' expensive hobbies yielded results. Festival choreographers coordinated parades, jousts, and pageants, often improvising solutions when chaos threatened. Without them, noble households and towns would lose cohesion, morale, and prestige. Certain roles straddled danger and superstition. Charm makers, exorcism assistants, and ritual specialists often operated at the intersection of religion, medicine, and folklore. Their labor ranged from preparing talismans to performing complex ceremonies meant to protect crops, livestock, or families. While the line between efficacy and superstition was blurry, these jobs were socially vital, integrating cultural beliefs with practical problem solving. Then there were professions linked to communication and intelligence. Town criers specializing in scandal, rumor, or warning systems had to memorize messages, navigate crowded streets, and maintain credibility. Their work was physically demanding, socially delicate, and occasionally dangerous if powerful individuals disliked the news being spread. Their labor kept citizens informed, markets running, and social order intact. Even in rural areas, there were odd, necessary jobs: goose herders, scarecrow managers, and hedge trimmers for defensive boundaries were vital for agriculture and security. Goose herders managed flocks for eggs, meat, and manure. Scarecrows protected crops, and hedges often doubled as fences to prevent theft or intrusion. Each role may seem trivial or comical today, yet medieval life depended on their meticulous attention. In conclusion, these rare, strange, and overlooked medieval jobs remind us that human ingenuity thrives under necessity, risk, and societal expectation. From ceremonial assistants and dovecote keepers to plague diggers, ritual specialists, and agricultural auditors, these roles show that survival and culture required a diverse, adaptable, and often invisible workforce. By examining these hidden professions, we gain a richer understanding of the Middle Ages, not as a world of knights and kings alone, but as a complex ecosystem sustained by countless individuals whose labor history often ignores. Their stories, strange as they may be, are testaments to resilience, creativity, and the enduring human ability to meet the demands of life, no matter how bizarre, dirty, or dangerous. And with that, we conclude our journey through the hidden world of medieval jobs, the work nobody talks about, but everyone depended on.